All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I was thinking that we were going to spend some time in the beginning introducing ourselves, but I forgot that you were going to do it for us. So thankfully, now we can use that time towards the presentation because there's a lot of things to share. So you kind of uh, presented a little bit of my career trajectory. It has been a very weird journey for me, starting with physics and then computational and visual neuroscience. And now I'm working with psychedelics, getting increasingly more interested in psychology, in transpersonal psychology. And if you think about this career trajectory, it feels to me that it will be very meaningful for me to be connected with the community surrounding the California Institute of Integral Studies in the future. And for this reason, I cannot tell you how badly I wanted to be there in person, but I couldn't. I went to the U.S. consulate in Brazil and I said, hey, I was in the U.S. for 12 years. I did a Ph.D. and a postdoc, and I left on time. I'm now doing my second postdoc, and here is an official invitation letter to speak at this conference. And they said, we can't give you a travel visa because essentially because we think you're going to go underground, you're going to become an undocumented illegal alien. So that was pretty shocking, but I feel like that is only one of the facets of the kind of crisis time that we're going through in the world today, a world that is increasingly suffused with tribalism and divisiveness. And today, what we want to talk about is a different crisis, which is the ecological crisis. So I'll dive right into it. And in the end, we can take some questions. All right. So in this talk, I'm going to be presenting several different topics that on the surface seem to not have much to do with each other, but I will strive to draw some connections between them. Of course, the central figure is Jung. And as I'm presenting these topics, I would like you guys to just keep an eye out for where you see Jung's influences in all of these ideas. So the first topic is the climate crisis, the ongoing climate crisis. And then I'm going to talk about psychedelics, also going to talk about collective consciousness and transpersonal experiences and non-duality. And then there's a term that I'm going to introduce. There is a paper associated with this presentation in which we have coined this term for the first time. It seemed kind of an important idea to develop, called the psychosphere. And during this talk, I'm going to try and explain to you what we mean by this and the connections between all of these topics. So let's start with the climate crisis and the philosophy of materialism. What we can say is that reductionism, materialism, and individualism rule the world. Individualism, particularly more in the Western world. And Dr. River Lu spoke about this as well in her talk in this conference, where she said, she kind of called this the left brain dominance of the world. What we can say is that in the last couple of centuries, and particularly in the last couple of decades, we have had tremendous success with materialism and reductionism, seeing the world as material and solving problems by breaking them down into parts and seeing everything as just built up of these different parts. That's materialism and reductionism. And specifically in the realms of science and technology, we have had amazing progress. These philosophies have given us many solutions and many powers, but they have also brought many new problems. But there is no doubt that we now live in a world ruled by this kind of thinking. This is the kind of thinking that is believed, that is respected, and seen as the right way of thinking in many situations. And what I would argue is that it feels like the pendulum has swung too far. And this is something that Dr. Lu also said, the dominance of the left brain. Analysis and categorization has taken priority of the left brain instead of the holistic view. What I can tell you from having done a PhD in physics is from a reductive lens, the world is only material. And this worldview is responsible for the way that we have treated the planet, a dominance of just thinking and not as much feeling. Um, I'll share a personal story. When I was a child, there was this really tall coconut tree growing next to our house. And one day, the grown-ups, for some reason, decided to chop down this coconut tree. And I had this sense of kinship with this tree, and I felt so sad that I felt like I really needed to cry, but somehow I felt like I couldn't cry in front of these grown-ups. So I ran away. I went to the roof of the house where I knew I was by myself, and I was just in a corner crying about this coconut tree. And the reason that I had to hide away is because I knew that the grown-ups were just making rational decisions, and my emotions are an inconvenience that is getting in the way. So my feeling was an inconvenience that was getting in the way of their thinking. And so my feelings were invalidated. And I feel like this story is a microcosm of what is happening around the world today. I believe that a lot of children intrinsically have this sensitivity and empathy towards nature, but as we grow up in this culture, children lose their sensitivity, and we often become desensitized in the way that I did. And I'm at a stage in my life when I'm trying to resensitize myself. Jungian analyst and climate scientist Jeffrey Keel. This is a very interesting guy. He's a climate scientist and a Jungian analyst. He said that the processes that have contributed to our current state of climate chaos include our one-sided emphasis on reductive rational thinking, which dissects the world into pieces, creating collective dissociation. But if we look around the world today, we'll see that the dominant solutions that are being worked on, that are being proposed as climate crisis solutions, are also mainly intellectual, technological, and material. And what we are advocating for is that seeing the planet as only material and climate solutions as only material solutions cannot solve this problem entirely. We believe that a holistic climate solution needs us to see the psychic layer of nature and our psychic connection to this layer. And I'm going to elaborate on this in the slides that are coming. And this perspective incorporates not just a thinking about the planet, not just a thinking about how to solve the climate crisis, but a feeling, an experiential and emotional participation. And what is the role of psychedelics in this entire business? First of all, to me, something that's amazing as someone who comes from the hard sciences or the natural sciences is that psychedelics present to me a paradox. It is a material that manifests the spiritual. I mean, this is amazing. We know that in low doses, psychedelics help to break through the ego into the personal unconscious, or what Jung called the shadow self. And this is something that assists therapy. But we have also learned that at high doses of psychedelics, the experience sometimes expands beyond the individual experience entirely, and these are called transpersonal experiences. And in fact, in the 1960s, there was a lot of experimentation going on with psychedelics, and this is partly what catalyzed the emergence and development of the entire field of transpersonal psychology. Before transpersonal psychology, Western psychology was greatly dominated by Freudian thought. And the emphasis of Freudian thought was always the personal history, the personal psychology, the personal complexes. And what transpersonal psychology did is it took us beyond Freud's focus of personal psychology into the wider spiritual, environmental, and cosmic aspects of our consciousness, of our being, but it pervades into the universe. Christopher Batch, who was a Harvard University professor of religious studies, took 73 really strong doses of LSD, and he wrote this book called LSD and the Mind of the Universe about his experiences. And he wrote in this book that in some of these deep psychedelic experiences, he completely left his individual psyche, and he felt the consciousness not of himself, not even of another person, but he experienced the consciousness and trauma of an entire population of people that were being killed and wounded in war at some point in the history of our planet. And Stanislav Grof, who had contributed much to the field of transpersonal psychology, had written previously that such psychedelic transpersonal experiences involve transcendence of the limitations of the skin-encapsulated ego. Identifying with the consciousness of an entire group of people, one can transcend the limits of the human experience and identify with the consciousness of various animals and plants. It is possible to experience consciousness of the entire biosphere of our planet or the entire material universe. So we can see through these different kinds of accounts that psychedelics are able to manifest this kind of planetary consciousness through these transpersonal experiences. So this brings us to what I believe is a very interesting question as a scientist, in particular a neuroscientist. What lies beyond our personal mind? And there are several theories that have been developed over the last several decades about this idea of what lies beyond the personal mind. And of course, in the beginning, I have to talk about Jung. He presented this idea of the collective unconscious. And I think the collective is a word that's very important here. This is something that's deeper even than your personal unconscious. It's a collective layer. And what he believed was that human development over the course of our lifetime involves integrating material and wisdom from not only the personal unconscious, but also the collective unconscious into the conscious. So he saw this collective unconscious as not only a real thing, but a storehouse of rich wisdom. Aldous Huxley, who did a lot of experimentation with psychedelics, wrote later that he believes that there exists a universal field of consciousness that he called the mind at large. And he also said that contrary to popular belief, I mean, this is what most scientists believe, that the brain is the generator of consciousness. But he wrote that contrary to that belief, he believes that the brain is rather the opposite. It is a reducing valve that reduces the flow of this universal field of consciousness called the mind at large into what he called a measly trickle of personal individual consciousness that mostly serves the function of staying alive on this planet. And he also believed that psychedelics open this valve and allow us to connect to this mind at large with higher bandwidth. Now, these are kind of airy ideas and philosophies that have been kind of floating around for several decades. But more recently, there has been recent neuroscience research that has lent a stronger credence to these ideas because we have found that the ingestion of psychedelics disrupt the activity and connectivity of the default mode network, which is a network in the brain that is mostly responsible for manifesting the ego through autobiographical memories, through mind wandering and rumination, etc. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about where we stand in terms of theories and science about what lies beyond the personal mind. So I want to go a little bit deeper into this idea of collective consciousness specifically, and the philosophy and science of it. The first question that I'm very curious to ask as a scientist is this even a thing that is possible? Is there such a thing as the consciousness of a group of beings, like what was reported by Christopher Batch and Stanislav Grof? So if you think about this question, we have a human body and we have different parts of our body, like the organs and organelles. Is it possible that each of our body parts has its own little consciousness? And conversely, can we say that there exists such a thing as a big consciousness of collections of beings, such as the entire planet? In the philosophy of panpsychism, which posits that everything in the universe elementally has the intrinsic property of consciousness, these questions is called the combination problem. And it's in fact one of the most critical problems, that's unsolved problems that's facing panpsychism today. And to put it simply, the combination problem is this. If each tiny part of me has its own private feeling, how come I experience one unified stream of consciousness instead of trillions of microscopic ones? Recently, once again, there has been some neuroscience research which is hypothesizing that a phenomenon called neural synchrony, which is the synchronization of high frequency activity of neurons at large scale, is the thing that underlies unified consciousness. So it has already been proposed that neural synchrony within a single brain of a human is what underlies the subjective experience of having of the fact that that human experiences a unified consciousness. But there are a couple of other intriguing experiments that kind of take this idea a little bit further. And one of them is the idea, the phenomenon of split brain patients. I don't know if you guys have heard about this. These are people whose connective tissue between the two brain hemispheres, called the corpus callosum, had to be cut for a number of reasons. Usually it's because they were experiencing epileptic seizures, and this corpus callosum was cut to limit the propagation of these epileptic seizures. And in many ways, these people act as if there are two independent humans living in the same body. And one interesting way to see that are these kind of very famous experiments. Here's my laser, that were conducted on split brain patients. So here's the person with the split brain. They're flashed two words, one on the left side and one on the right side of the screen. The left half of your visual field only projects to the right hemisphere, and the right half of the visual field only projects to the left hemisphere. When they're flashed these two words, they're asked, did you see any words? And they say, I only saw the word ring. And the reason is that the word ring was projected to the left hemisphere, which is the verbal brain, the conscious brain. And so the person is conscious of having seen the word ring. Sorry, I'm getting, oh, is that for me? Something in the chat? Oh, no, that's not for me. Okay, so they say that they saw the word ring. They don't say that they saw the word key, even though their right hemisphere saw it, because the right hemisphere is silent and it's not conscious. Okay, now with their left hand, they are asked to pick up the object that they saw. Even though they said that they saw the word ring, their left hand, which is controlled by the right hemisphere, the silent hemisphere, picks up the ring. Or sorry, picks up the key, which is what the right hemisphere saw. And the person is left confused. I don't know why I picked up the key. So these kinds of experiments elucidate that split brain patients are living as if there are a lot of the times two independent humans living inside a body, and the two hemispheres are not communicating with each other. And this neural synchrony that I talked about is no longer present across the entire brain of these patients, but confined to each half. So once again, it seems like the existence of this neural synchrony is what determines what will be feeling the unified consciousness. So in the context of the split brain patients, now you can think that the moment you join these two hemispheres, you become like you and me. So it is sort of, you can think of this as an example of collective consciousness, where the left brain person and the right brain person are now fused together. As we go about our lives, we do not feel like two people, we feel like one person. But this could be how a collective consciousness feels experientially, as long as there's neural synchrony across the entire substrate, whether it be a single brain or a half of brain. Another really interesting experiment that happened recently showed that such neural synchrony can happen even across multiple people. So they hooked up co-pilots to these EEG skull caps, and they found that their brain waves start to synchronize in the same way that there exists synchrony within a single brain, but only during cooperative tasks, not during competition or individual tasks. So they saw this neural synchrony starting to happen between the brains of the co-pilots during takeoff and landing, but not during cruise, when they were kind of each doing their own thing. So the other interesting thing is that the degree of synchrony that existed between the two brains was correlated with the degree to which they subjectively felt merged or together with each other. So this is fascinating. So what we can begin to say or begin to explore in the realm of neuroscience is that the phenomenon of unified consciousness, whether it be across a single brain, half a brain, or multiple brains, the phenomenon that underlies this is neural synchrony. There has been a recent review of this neuroscience research that says that these findings result in a shift in our understanding of human consciousness. Although a still debated proposal, an extension of consciousness could be possible in light of these findings. Now we'll take one more step towards collective consciousness and talk about the consciousness of the planet, the idea of the world soul, and also about non-duality. This is something that was mentioned a couple of times in this conference, the idea of the anima mundi, or the world soul. This is an idea that is a pretty ancient idea, goes all the way back to Plato at least, and possibly to even more ancient cultures. Lovelock more recently also talked about the Gaia hypothesis, and both of these ideas are pretty similar, which is that the planet or the world is a living organism animated by shared conscious energy. So the idea is that the universe is a living, interconnected organism with a soul or spiritual essence that permeates all of nature. And everything in the world in existence is bound by an underlying unity, like cells within a body, and animated by a shared consciousness or spirit. And we saw in this conference already that Dr. Lu talked about the universal energy Qi in the Chinese worldview, in which the whole world is permeated by a unified energy. And in the paper that's associated with this presentation, we have talked more about this Qi. But what we can also introduce in this context is another ancient idea that comes from India, specifically the Hindu text Advaita Vedanta. And the word Advaita means not two. So this is the idea of non-duality. And I will present to you briefly what is the non-duality philosophy, what is the cosmology according to this non-duality philosophy. And what it says is that all of reality, not just the planet, all of reality is a unified being that is called Brahma. But there is a cosmic game of self-delusion. Brahma is playing a cosmic game of self-delusion, and this game is called Maya. And in this game, Brahma appears split into a world of many. But this is just a game, this is an illusion. So the separation between self and other, between the subject and object of experience, between self and the world, me and the environment, are illusory. And the goal of spiritual practice is to cut through this mind spell, this dream, this illusion dream of Maya, and to realize that ultimate cosmic unification of the Brahma. However, the ego, the small s self, has many attachments and a lot of resistance. It wants to stay in Maya. It wants to keep propagating its story in the Maya, and it has a lot of resistance to realizing this oneness with Brahma. And some of you might already be starting to recognize parallels with Jung's theory of the capital S self, which has been called the numinous center of collective psyche. And in my understanding, this is kind of analogous to what the ancient Indian scriptures called Brahma. And Jeffrey Keel has written a very similar thing, that the ego often resists the analytic work, leading to an awareness of the capital S self. So with all of these different pieces in place, I would like to present sort of the first central idea of this presentation, which is the idea of the ecological trauma that's occurring in the collective planetary psyche. And the idea is that the collective psyche at the planet scale is experiencing a large-scale trauma of ecological destruction. It's really serious. We don't have a lot of time left. And this pain manifests in our individual minds, even without psychedelics, for the people who are more empathetic and more sensitive, as climate grief or climate anxiety. Climate grief or climate anxiety is rapidly skyrocketing as the #1 public psychology policy concern around the world. And through this lens that we have presented here, we can see that climate anxiety is more profound than we normally regard it to be. It's not just an intellectual or engineering or technological concern for another, be it the environment or the planet, but through this lens, it is a visceral pain for an extended self. So the analogy that we have here that I'm depicting through this picture is if we can see our individual psychologies as leaves and the planetary psyche as the tree, then it's obvious that our individual psyche will be distressed when it is just an appendage of the collective psyche that's sick. So it's the climate grief and climate anxiety is just the sickness of the tree manifesting in its wilting leaves. So this is sort of one of the central ideas that I wanted to share with you today. So the question now is, okay, where do we go from here? And once again, what I will emphasize is the role of psychedelics, because psychedelics are often empathogens that can pierce through our isolation and desensitization from the climate trauma. Many psychedelic experiences directly resurface our deep psychological connection with nature. Several years ago, I went to New York City to attend the Horizons Psychedelic Conference, and I left the conference to get some lunch, and then at the place, they gave me like 2 lunch things by mistake, and I was walking back with one of them, and I saw this homeless girl on the street, and I gave her the food, and she opened the box, she saw there was meat in it, and she gave it back to me and said, "I'm vegan, I'm sorry I cannot eat this, but I hope that you can give this to someone else." And I was really awestruck, and I sat down and I had a conversation with her about how she manages to stick to this principle while being unhoused. And it was such a great conversation. I recorded it, and I have a podcast, and this conversation is on the podcast, and you can follow this with the QR code. And what she essentially told me was that she was not vegan, but there was one day that she and her friend went up on a hill and she took some LSD. And in that moment, she felt at one. She said that she could experience the life of all of the trees and all of the blades of grass for miles around, that she became part of it. And in the evening, she and her friend came down from the hill, and her friend said, "Man, oh, that was a big experience. Let's go get a burger." And she said, "I don't think I'll be able to touch animal meat ever again in my life." Now, of course, this is not everyone's experience, but I think this stands as a stark example of how radically sometimes psychedelic experiences can transform our perspective. And another aspect is that for some indigenous communities around the world, plant medicines, they don't even call them psychedelics. Plant medicines have been a direct link or a direct manifestation of the nature spirit. For example, the Amazonian jungle brew ayahuasca. The indigenous people do not regard this as some kind of a molecule that goes into your brain and triggers some kind of a neurochemical cascade. For them, ayahuasca is a manifestation of grandmother Aya, the spirit of Mother Nature or Mother Earth. Luke, in 2013, who's a Jungian ecopsychologist, wrote that these substances have recently been dubbed ecodelics. The insight arising from their ingestion is the sudden and absolute conviction that the psychonaut is involved in a densely interconnected ecosystem for which contemporary tactics of human identity are insufficient. All right, now I will introduce another of the topics that I said that I would touch on, and that's the idea of emotional energy. So what is emotional energy? Now, we have been talking about transpersonal experiences, and I would say that transpersonal experiences make different consciousnesses more permeable and connected with each other. But it does so on a kind of esoteric level. Not everyone has transpersonal experiences. But something else that does this on a much more human day-to-day level is emotional energy that is channeled through empathy across beings. Now, what is emotional energy? This idea of emotional energy is something that was once a pillar of depth psychology, but now it has been sidelined because it's unmeasurable. And for someone like me coming from the world of physics, dealing with energy, kinetic energy, potential energy, heat energy, electromagnetic energy. This is a very fascinating idea. Um, okay, it's sure we don't have measuring devices, objective devices that can measure emotional energy, but we can already say a few things about its properties. For example, one important property is this, that it spreads across beings in a phenomenon called emotional contagion. Jung also wrote about this. And the other thing is that, yes, it's true, we don't have any objective detectors with which to detect emotional energy in the way that we have detectors for other kinds of physical energy. But we have subjective detectors. The bodies and minds and hearts of conscious beings like us receive and transmit this emotional energy. So far we have this interesting kind of energy that is not detected by objects, but only subjects. There was an interesting study where they asked people to self-report where in their body they were feeling increases or decreases of sensation when they were in different states of different kinds of emotions, and these kinds of maps resulted. And does not look all that different from like infrared maps of heat and things like that. So, what we can say is that our bodies are these devices that are receivers and transmitters of this thing called emotional energy. We can draw some more interesting comparisons to physical energy, whose existence is now, of course, acknowledged as real everywhere around the world. For example, heat. So if you consider heat, before the invention of infrared cameras, we could not see heat. We did not have a picture of it. We could not see it flowing from one object to another. But we had experiences of seeing things like, for example, a stone that's left by the fire becomes hot, and then later on it can store this heat and can transmit this warmth to a bowl of water. In a similar way, we can say that a person who absorbed emotional suffering due to a difficult childhood may store it in their body throughout their entire life and may transmit this to the people around them at a later point in their lives. So what I would be very excited to know is perhaps this thing called emotional energy has similar natural laws of how it flows and how it transmutes, similar to physical energy. And in the future, it is possible that we will discover more about its properties. Something that is relevant to this topic of emotional energy is once again the role of psychedelics in that they release trapped emotional energy. It has been shown that negative psycho-emotional energy is absorbed during moments of trauma. It can be held in the body, specifically the myofascial system of connective tissue. And psychedelics are one of the agents that help release this stored emotional energy. Perkins wrote recently that drinking ayahuasca, for example, involves an energetic force, sometimes relating to the plant energy, moving into and taking over the body or nervous system. Drinkers frequently experience specific healings from ayahuasca somatically in the body and report precise awareness of how traumas and emotional issues were stored in and released from their bodies. So I'm presenting a lot of kind of different ideas, and I'm going to try and connect some of them together with this word that I mentioned. Is kind of a new idea that we have been developing called the psychosphere. And the psychosphere, as we are imagining it, is the psycho-emotional network of planet Earth. So it's kind of like the lithosphere or the atmosphere or the biosphere, which are the different kinds of layers through which we see the planet, but this one is not material. It's kind of analogous to the subjective feelings network across the body of an organism. And what you can say is that it's sort of the network of flow of this psychic or emotional energy across the beings of the planet. If you look at this graphic, it kind of looks mostly like a spatial network of emotional energy channeling across beings in the planet, but it is also a temporal network in the sense that these energetic influences flow across time. So if you look at this graphic, if you imagine each of these as beings, as conscious beings, at any moment, a conscious being might be receiving as input the psycho-emotional input that it receives from other beings. And then it has some capacity to be transmuting the nature of this energy within itself before it sends it on to other beings, other things that it is doing in its life. And you can see, for example, that maybe this guy over here had some negative emotional energy that it was storing, and then it transmits it on to, this was guy, and then to his daughter, and then this daughter channels it on to someone else in the next generation. So you can trace this as, this is an example of intergenerational trauma. So if you look at this starts to look a little bit like the diagrams of artificial neural networks these days, the way that the information propagates through neural networks, in much the same way. Each node in the network receives input from a lot of other nodes. It has some agency to do some transformation within it, and then it sends it on to a bunch of other nodes. So if you think about it this way, we are all nodes in the nervous system of the psychosphere of the planet. And what I would argue is our life's work, spiritual work, can be seen as becoming a better transformer of this emotional energy. We are not just the product of the different kinds of energies that we receive. We have some agency to transmute it before it ripples onwards from us in our interactions with other people and the legacy that we leave with our life. Rick Tarnas, in one of the opening speeches of this conference, also said the same thing, that an enormous number of influences from many sources and many times in history is feeding into us in every moment. And for that reason, this moment is not flat, it's deep. Yet we are not only a product of this, we have agency. What we think and speak and act ripples out into the world, and this is a great responsibility. So I just wanted to kind of describe the idea of this psychosphere as not being just a spatial network, but evolving in time. So in biology, we can talk about individual cells and their interactions, but we can also talk about the whole organism as a single entity. In the same way, we can think about the psychosphere as interactions of emotional energy between the individual beings, or we can talk about the psyche of the whole planet entity. And what it seems like the psyche of the entire planet stores large-scale collective trauma, such as wars and slavery and things that have happened in the past. Normally, it's hidden away from the awareness of the individual consciousness, the individual psyche of the nodes that you see in these networks, but sometimes it's revealed in transpersonal states. And ecological trauma, I would argue, is another example of such large-scale collective trauma that spreads across this network and leaks into individual minds. I gathered that maybe I got a time warning or something, right? Yeah. Yeah. I think I'll
Yeah, 5 minutes until we open question and answer.
Okay, sure. Yes. So the idea is that caring for the planet is not just caring for the lithosphere and biosphere, the material aspects of the planet, but also the psychosphere, like you would do for a person who's ailing. Towards the end of this talk, I want to talk a little bit about the psychedelic renaissance, the promise and peril. Albert Hoffman, who invented LSD, said, "Alienation from nature and the loss of the experience of being part of the living creation is the greatest tragedy of our materialistic era. It is the causative reason for ecological devastation and climate change. Therefore, I attribute absolute highest importance to consciousness change. I regard psychedelics as catalyzers for this." So this third wave of psychedelics is arriving at a critical time to transform minds. Maybe this is a synchronicity. But there are some perils. The first thing is this renaissance is mostly a white phenomenon. The plant medicines have been with the indigenous people throughout. So in some ways, we have to stay a little bit wary of the white person discovering psychedelics for everyone again. It has kind of like colonial connotations. And also, psychedelics alone without orientation can go in any direction. There has been recent research that the use of psychedelics can boost authoritarian and right-wing ideologies as well. As someone who's doing this research, only reductive and materialistic psychedelic research is taken seriously, where we explain the psychedelic phenomenon using only chemical and material narratives. The molecule becomes important, not the ceremonial context. If you don't have this reductive materialist quantitative story, it's harder to be published or be taken seriously. The ancestral knowledge and sacredness is often dismissed. Uriah Seligman, who's an indigenous scholar, says, Western recreational use of our spirit medicines is not always a sacred act. Our own indigenous medicine systems continue to be dismissed, persecuted, blatantly extracted, exploited, and capitalized upon. The authority of the indigenous peoples must be recognized and respected as equal holders of sophisticated systems of contemplative insight. And this ancestral knowledge is one of the reasons that I decided to move from the United States to Brazil to do my psychedelics research, because the indigenous perspective is more alive in this country. The other thing that we have to be careful about is commodification by capitalism. Big pharma is poised to extract the psychedelic, modify it, and then patent it and sell it for profit. And we have already seen this happen with Ayurvedic capitalism in India. So I'll summarize. We believe that materialism, reductionism, and individualism are greatly responsible for the climate crisis. We describe this idea of the ecological trauma in the planetary psyche, and that psychedelic transpersonal experiences help us connect to this planetary psyche, and this has been talked about by some other speakers in this conference. And we believe that holistic climate solution needs to recenter our psychic connection with nature and the importance of the psychosphere. And cautious optimism for the third wave. I would just remind everyone that I believe we need to protect and recenter indigenous views. And with that, I'll end the talk. We have a preprint of our paper available online. The QR code is over here. We have connected to much more existing ideas and theories, including global cultural views. It's like a real huge web of interconnected ideas. There's 116 references at the moment. So if you have time and interest, I welcome you to take a look. There's also a QR code for this presentation and our contact information. And now we will take some questions.
Thank you so much, Abhranil, for that, wonderful presentation. Wonderful and rich presentation. For anyone on Zoom, if you want to direct message me your questions, I can read them to the presenter. And Mary, if you have anything in person, let me know.
Is there anyone in the room with a question? We are all so stunned here. What an amazing presentation. And I can't believe there's a QR code with your whole presentation on it. That's splendid. I'll pass it back. Okay, we do have a question.
It's not so much a question as an operation.
Okay, let's hear it. You don't need to hold a second.
I just wanted to express my appreciation for this research, and also I have been looking for specifically the term psychosphere has been something that I've been missing for a while. I've looked into similar concepts such as the new sphere, and it lacked a lot of substance that I see this is going to bring into the research, and I'm very appreciative of that.
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, in the first version when I wrote this paper, I did not have this word psychosphere. I just had like paragraphs of like a lot of words trying to basically explain the same thing. It was a picture in my head because this is the invisible part of what's going on. The way that the emotional energy is channeling. And the original idea was that there are many ways in which we can try to isolate ourselves from the climate crisis. Like the rich people can build their fortresses and forget about, but there are ways in which you cannot shield off the effect of the emotional trauma. If the rest of the planet is burning, it's going to get to you psychically. And how does it get to you? And I started imagining there is this network of like a psycho-emotional network. And I used a lot of words, and then I thought, why don't I just like make a word for this? And I started looking into it, and I found this word called noosphere, but it was not the same thing. It was something about the sphere of human reasoning and things like that. And I was like, no, I'm not talking about reasoning. I'm talking about feelings. non-humans can also feel, like a baby can feel, like the planet can feel. It's not about reasoning. So, and I realized that such a word does not exist. And instead of using paragraphs, I'm like, I'm gonna write those paragraphs, but first I think I need a word. And so yeah. So that was the story of that. Yes, we have another question, a couple other questions.
And I
Right.
have one online as well from Alexander Galileo. I'll send it to you, Abhranil.
Okay.
Oh,
It's kind of a long question. Are there ways to bring people closer to having transpersonal experiences with psychedelics who have not previously had them with psychedelics, but have taken psychedelics? I would say my gut reaction is always exercise caution about wanting to induce some kind of a psychedelic experience for someone. That is sort of like risky grounds. I If someone is, and these experiences, transcendental experiences, are not something that you can totally engineer. Of course, you can keep taking higher and higher doses, but psychedelics are powerful substances and they can be risky. So I would say that taking psychedelics with the goal of wanting to have transpersonal experiences is like strapping oneself to a rocket and hoping it goes in a certain direction, but it's really risky. There's more slow ways like spiritual practice. But when you ask this question, the immediate feeling I get is like, oh, that's kind of risky. You have to step carefully into the transcendental realm, and not just depend on taking stronger doses. There's some other part of this question. What are some potential ways we can investigate whether experiences we can often have which can are coming from something that exists outside of us or solely from our own consciousness, like some might argue? I would say this is kind of a false dichotomy, possibly. First of all, we don't really know. Oh, the question is, how do we know that these transcendental experiences are coming from some other consciousness beyond our personal mind? Or is it just a manifestation of our personal consciousness? And what I would say is that before we answer those questions, one thing is that we don't even know what consciousness is. So how do we know that consciousness is not this shape-shifting entity that is sometimes attached to your physical human body, sometimes can expand into like the bigger consciousness and can kind of shuttle back and forth? And if it can do that, then it's kind of like a fluid thing. And we don't really have to fall into this dichotomy of whether it came from the outside or the inside, if the two can be plugged anyway. Yes, and now I think I would like to take some questions from the room.
Okay, yes, we have a few questions. Let's see, I thought, we have like 4 questions. Do
Yes.
you want to go first?
I need to talk into a mic
No, you can just stand near me.
with you. All right.
We're having a neural connection here.
Amazing. I love it. Very appropriate. Thank you for this very rich and well-packaged conversation. It's a really ambitious task that you undertook to try to cover all of this in an hour. So just want to voice appreciation for that. My curiosity is around whether you see any differentiation between, like, a lot of us, I think, talk about psychedelics as one homogeneous whole. Yet I thought I heard some differentiation between plant medicines and like synthetic creations of modernity, such as ketamine or even LSD, right? And we look at, I mean, if you're stationed in Brazil, there's been a lot of writing done in this where the ayahuasca itself is not even the delivery of the medicine, right? The indigenous people don't eat, like, you don't even necessarily need to ingest the psychedelic. It is through the channeling and through the sounds and the sound vibrations and all of that that healing comes about. And so, like, that makes me wonder about the, like, collective transgenerational memory that gets carried on through the plant, potentially through all the water molecules or things we don't understand, that gets carried on through the spirit of something that was alive, and how that gets differentiated from the reductionism of taking that into a molecular state and trying to recreate that into a lab, which then I think fuels some of your points on capitalism and where big pharma is going. So any comments on that would be
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for the point. You made this point so beautifully. And as someone who has come from the world of materialistic science, wanting to do this kind of research in the psychedelic realm, these are the kinds of questions that scientists like us are having to wrestle with every day. I will give you one example. I think the story is not so clear that natural plant-derived things are always more holistic and better than synthetic stuff. One example is that in this lab, we were first trying to bring ayahuasca treatment as a therapeutic intervention into the Brazilian public health system. And we ran clinical trials in this lab, and they turned out to be extremely challenging for a number of reasons. First, the ayahuasca experience is long, people start throwing up, they can have extremely kind of traumatizing experiences which are difficult to control within a clinical setting. And there are regulatory problems. If you want to bring this as a therapeutic intervention into the public health system, one of the regulatory requirements is that you have to know exactly what you're giving to the person and the concentration. But every time you make ayahuasca, it's different and the concentration is different. So right there, the progress was stopped. The other problem is that ayahuasca rightfully belongs to the indigenous people. So the question of intellectual property came in as part of this problem. In order to bring it to the public health system, we can't just have little groups of people making batches of ayahuasca. There has to be a company that manufactures this at large scale, and the Brazilian laws are not going to allow this because of the rules of intellectual property. So we started moving more towards DMT, and you could say this is a more reductionist approach. This is the psychotropic molecule that's present in the ayahuasca, and you're removing it from the context. However, this is something that you can synthesize, and this does not infringe upon the intellectual properties of the indigenous people. And every time you make it, you know exactly the concentration. It's only a 15-minute experience that's much easier to control within the lab. So if our interest is to bring something into the free public health system that actually helps a large number of people who have treatment-resistant depression, this synthetic molecule, by the way, how synthetic is it? It's in our brains at this moment, you know? So I feel like this world is a very complex world, and simple answers are very difficult to arrive at, but I think that's also what makes my life and my work much more activating and energizing, because you cannot arrive at a simple answer. And it's a really complex interwoven thread happening, and you have to keep your brain on all the time. You have to keep your ethics on all the time, because you cannot just arrive at a conclusion and know that that's it. Okay, we are no longer going to do DMT research because we don't want these people to get better because of this reason. So it's a complex world.
Oh, thank you. We have another question in the room here.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been just incredible, very illuminating, and you're a wonderful, wonderful presenter as well. Wish you could have been here. Wanted to ask you, Abhranil, if you have heard a podcast called The Telepathy Tapes, and if
Yes.
not, you have? Okay, wonderful. Yeah, just wondered if you could share what you made of that.
It's interesting that you bring this up. My friends in Austin during my last few months started talking about this podcast called the Telepathy Tapes. And one of the reasons they brought this up is because I had been starting to talk about telepathic experiences that I had personally had in my life. And both times I was on some psychedelic or the other. And the second time that this happened was actually quite amazing. I had come to Brazil for my first ayahuasca retreat. And on day 4 of the ayahuasca ceremony, this was the 4th time I took ayahuasca, it was like a voice started speaking inside my head, but it was not really a voice. It was almost like a very strong thought, like almost like, oh, my leg feels itchy, I need to scratch. It's not like a voice is telling you, but it's kind of a compulsion. But it wasn't such a strong compulsion that I had to do it. I could decide whether to do it or not. And I thought, what is this? Who is this? And so I thought about what it was asking me to do, and it was asking me to do very specific things at that moment, like Neil, get up, stand in the center of the room and see what happens. And so every time I followed what it was saying, what opened up was a door of learning for me. And after that experience, I am still left very confused and intrigued by what that was. People have talked about ayahuasca as inducing telepathic powers before. I think some of the chemicals found inside ayahuasca are now called harmine or harmaline or something like that. But in the past, they were called telepathine You can look this up because it was believed that they allowed the indigenous people to develop their powers of telepathy and use that for hunting, etc. I haven't fully watched the telepathy tapes, but shortly before leaving Austin, I gave a talk on the connection between telepathy and psychedelics. And the concluding point that I will make is that in this presentation, I talked about several different modes of experiences in which we go outside the bounds of our normal everyday consciousness. Transpersonal experiences are a way in which the walls become more permeable. And I think telepathy is another example of permeability between consciousnesses. And despite being this person who has a physics PhD and used to be this kind of rationalist, scientific, materialist, reductionist person, I will just say that the world is full of mystery and we don't know yet what we are going to find. And I think it is quite possible that phenomena like this are still waiting just beyond our understanding.
Okay, I understand there is a question on the Zoom. Go ahead.
Yes, we have a question from Natalia Cohen. How do we center indigenous perspectives / wisdom and a feeling sense orientation to the world when it is so influenced by the dominant paradigm of rational materialism?
When you say it is dominated, I don't know what she means is dominated, but I would say if your interest is to center indigenous perspectives and wisdom, and you want to understand how to do it, then the idea is to find the indigenous people and let them tell you how. I think, yeah, I feel like we might try to engineer ways in which we take on the responsibility for recentering indigenous people, and that's kind of backwards. I feel like the process begins with listening. So don't have to do anything in the beginning. Don't have to do, just listen to create more platforms where indigenous voices take the center stage and cultivate. All we have to do is cultivate a greater sense of respect and humility and listening and believing and willingness to participate in their worldview. I mean, after a PhD in physics, I could have said, I know everything there is to know about the world. And I feel like this is something that's actually happening a lot in this field of psychedelics research. Is all of this rest of this shamanism stuff is not real. And all I'm saying is that just listen to this worldview a little bit more. And the more we listen, the more we will see that this worldview has a lot of power to already direct us in different directions. We don't have to worry too much about what to do as long as we believe and listen to respectfully the things that they're telling us from centuries of intergenerational wisdom.
Okay, we have about 4 more questions here, but you were the one next.
Hi, Ronnie. This is River. So, well, first of all, thank you for citing me. I feel very honored. And my question is really more of a personal question to you because you have repeatedly commented about yourself being one that used to be reductionist and materialist. And so what was the shift? Was it ayahuasca journey or what kind of conversations you had? And I'm asking this because I'm really interested in understanding how we may be able to talk to people that really are only rooted in a reductionistic kind of worldview and materialist world. Because sometimes when you talk to them, you hit this brick wall and they completely shut down, right? And so I really want to know, like, where is that trick to get past that wall?
I'm really excited that you asked me this question because this is something that I feel deeply, deeply, deeply passionate about. In the paper that I mentioned that's associated with this presentation, we dedicate a whole section to this, which I call, the collision of these ideas with scientism. Scientism is the belief that, all this, reductionism, materialism are the way to the truth. And the reason that I'm so passionate about this is because I feel like I have traversed from one world to the other. And I see a lot of people who are still in one or the other world. And honestly, one of the things that I want to do, that I would be very happy if I'm able to do with my life, is to contribute a little bit more to the building of this bridge between the two worlds. And what I believe is that this is actually connected to the climate crisis. If these two worlds remain separate, the climate crisis is not going to be solved. I think the climate crisis and many other crises in the world right now are demanding that we develop a more holistic worldview and we start to bridge the different domains of human enterprise. Speaking more from a personal perspective, my earliest experiences of the transcendental were not psychedelic. When I was in my mid-teens, I used to have visions of what would happen after I die, and these were involuntary visions. And eventually, I was able to draw connections between them, between these visions and a lot of other things that people talk about in religion and spirituality. But I think there was always a kind of kernel of within me of something connected to the mystery that I was actually deeply uncomfortable with. And at some point, I started going headlong in the direction of scientific materialism as a way to bury this part of me. And now I realize that that's what I was doing. But at some point during grad school, I noticed a certain change starting to happen. I started becoming interested in spirituality, particularly Buddhist meditation. And then eventually my psychedelic experiences happened. And I noticed that I had always had this kind of an ineffable connection to something mysterious in the universe. And I had tried to isolate myself from it. But now this connection was coming back and I was feeling less and less afraid of it. I mean, the whole story I cannot tell you in just a couple of minutes, but I will say that I have changed enormously as a person. And now I don't want to be just a person now on the other side hating on the materialists, because I don't see a lot of people who have gone from one end to the other, and I see myself as one of them. I also think that it is one of my responsibilities to try and bridge this world as much as possible. And when I try to talk to people who are very reductive and materialist, and I have a lot of friends in that world, I try to approach them with scientific, like really honesty. I don't try to convert them. I just say, look, this has been my experience, and you can ask me as much as you want about my experience. And what I will tell you is that I feel like I'm a scientist in the true sense, in that I believe that my pursuit is for the truth. And there are certain different ways of getting at the truth. There's objective, reproducible experiments, and then there's subjective experiences that happen directly to me, and I'm not going to discount that. And I can explain to you why I don't discount that. You haven't had my experience, so I am not going to fault you for not taking on my beliefs, but this is the reason why I believe these things. And I try to go at it with an attitude of collaboration and respect towards their intellect. And I try to present to them why I'm not following any other principles. I'm also following the principle of my own intellect and my own personal life experiences that have inevitably brought me to these conclusions. And you can listen to my story and make of it what you will. So I think I've noticed that kind of transparent, collaborative, more secure attitude goes a much greater distance than trying to come at them by like, oh, you need to change your mind about this.
Hi, Abhranil. Thank you so much. So my question is around the speed that you kind of mentioned about how we don't have that much time left.
Yeah.
And I think there's so much potential in both plant medicine and psychedelics, as well as spiritual practice, for individuals to develop a sense of connection with the earth and really tap into this sense of psychosphere. At the same time, there is this question of the speed and the urgency. So how might these practices that are a little bit more connective and spiritual really come into connection with policy, with structural change, and with the technological solutions for the climate crisis?
I mean, that's kind of a big question. And I cannot tell you that I mean, there's a lot of pieces in there. There is the psychedelic piece, which can catalyze a fast change. And the reason that I was emphasizing that is that, of course, you can get to a lot of these transcendent realizations through slower and more deep-rooted spiritual practice. But it seems like by the time the entire human generation gets there, we might not have a planet left. And this is the reason that I feel like it's kind of synchronistic that this third wave of psychedelics is occurring now. I do believe this is kind of not beside the point of your question, but I do believe that existence, that reality and life is indestructible, and it's going to continue appearing on the verge of destruction. But this is the cosmic game of Maya. And we don't know what form the next life is going to take. Maybe it's not going to be a human form. Maybe we're going to get wiped out. And we are interested about our survival into the future, but maybe the cosmos doesn't care. It's going to carry on in some other form. But if we want to carry on in this one, we have to do something quick. And psychedelics might provide a path forward. But I would say that I don't want to create a utopian narrative here, because if you look back into human history, there have been so many times in which it felt like we have stumbled upon the next utopian idea. And very soon, look at what happened with technology, with the internet. There's always a dark side, a shadow side, and the shadow side of the psychedelics are already emerging. So I feel like the nature of the cosmos is such that you can never have a free lunch. And we're just going to keep having to work through our karma, and there's always going to be tricks like this. So the question that you brought up has so many interlinked parts that I cannot begin to answer it. What I can say is that rather than becoming overwhelmed by all these interlocked problems across the world, what I try to do, and partly this is connected to my meditative practice, is realize that I have my own limited sphere of influence in my life. And this is my garden. This is what I'm responsible for. And even as the world is burning down, what am I doing is the thing that I try to focus on. And so I don't know. I mean, this might fall short of the kind of answer that you're expecting, but I usually try to stay focused on what I can do in my immediate circle of my influence.
If I may,
thank
if
you
I may
so
add
much for that.
something, if I may add something to that last
Yeah.
answer.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I feel is what my co-author is trying to say is psychedelics is not like a one-shot solution to anything. It's not something you jump to and come out the other end with all the solutions. I feel you start on a much smaller scale, on a more individual scale. You can do small things. I mean, even go and plant a tree for that matter, maybe. So I feel it's a step-by-step process, and psychedelics is a step that takes it to another level. But before you go to that level, which might be the last rung, which takes you to the upper floor, for a lack of a better analogy, I feel you need to take the first steps. You can't like climb to the second floor on the first go. So I feel that is where we can start, if that was your question.
Okay, we are really going to have to shut it down so people can get to the next keynote. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was,
Thank you.
I think you just inspired my dissertation, I have to say. And there's so much frustration in the room that wants more and more questions answered from both of you.